The gilded hallway of the Sovereign Hotel stretched before Clara like an opulent prison, its polished marble reflecting a distorted, exhausted version of herself. Clutching a roll of blueprints to her chest, her only shield in this world of quiet, predatory wealth, she fumbled with the keycard to her room. It blinked red. Again. A sigh of frustration escaped her lips as she noticed the adjacent door, Suite 1201, was slightly ajar. A sliver of darkness beckoned. Thinking it was a housekeeping oversight, and desperate for solitude, she pushed it open, stepping into a silence far deeper and more absolute than any she had ever known. The sprawling penthouse was steeped in shadows and the scent of expensive whiskey. A sound, a soft rustle from the bedroom, pulled her forward against her better judgment, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. There, emerging from a cloud of bathroom steam, stood a man whose presence seemed to consume the very air. He was a figure carved from marble and violence, a towel slung low on his hips, revealing a torso covered in a web of faded scars that spoke of a life she couldn't begin to imagine. But the silence that followed would change everything, and if you stay until the end, you will discover why. Subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. This was Clara Hayes, 28 years old, a junior architect with more talent than connections, and a quiet integrity that felt increasingly like a liability. The blueprints in her arms represented 2 years of sleepless nights and meticulous work, a tribute to a dream she fought to keep alive in a city that rewarded ruthlessness over artistry. She felt like a ghost haunting the edges of a world she was meant to design, but could never truly inhabit. Her worn briefcase and slightly frayed coat, a stark contrast to the seamless luxury that surrounded her. Her existence was a careful balance of fending off the condescending remarks of senior partners and managing the quiet ache of a profound, lingering loneliness that had settled in her bones long ago. The Sovereign Hotel was a symphony of suffocating elegance. The low hum of ventilation, the distant clinking of crystal glasses from the lobby bar below, and the muffled cadence of powerful voices making deals that could shatter lives. It all formed an oppressive soundtrack to her anxiety. She saw her reflection in the dark glass of a framed painting, a pale, serious face with eyes that held a story of loss. She felt the weight of every gaze from the perfectly composed staff, their polite smiles barely concealing a judgment she knew she deserved for being so out of place. This was a world built on unwritten rules and invisible hierarchies, and she was an intruder, a commoner, who had wandered into the king's court by mistake, armed with nothing but paper and a moral compass that pointed in a direction no one here seemed to recognize. This relentless pursuit of professional dignity was a promise she had made to her father, an honest architect bankrupted by men who operated from penthouses just like this one. His memory was both her driving force and her heaviest burden. Every line she drew, every calculation she made, was an attempt to build something clean and true in a world that seemed determined to corrupt it. This project, her first major design, was her chance to prove that his principles weren't a weakness. But the pressure was immense, a constant, low-grade fear that she would either fail and disappoint his legacy or succeed and become one of the very people he had despised. Her integrity was the last piece of him she had left, and she guarded it fiercely, even as it left her isolated and vulnerable. Her daily life was a testament to this struggle. It was a quiet routine of early mornings at a drafting table in her small apartment, long days enduring the passive aggression of her superiors, and late nights refining details no one else would ever notice. She navigated a landscape of subtle injustices, from having her ideas claimed by others in meetings to being overlooked for opportunities that were handed to less talented men with better connections. Each small slight was another crack in her armor, another reminder of the chasm between her aspirations and her reality. She was trapped in a cycle of striving, a silent battle fought in the margins of a city that celebrated loud, ostentatious success, leaving little room for the quiet strength of a woman determined to build her future on her own terms. The penthouse was the physical embodiment of the world she fought against. It was a space of cold, impersonal power, where every object, from the leather-bound books on the shelves to the single glass of amber liquid on the table, was a carefully chosen symbol of dominance. Her own world was one of measurements, of clear lines and transparent intentions. This place operated on a different logic entirely, a language of shadows, silence, and implicit threat. The man standing before her was the master of that language. He didn't need to speak. His stillness was a declaration of absolute control, his gaze a silent assessment that stripped away all her defenses, leaving her feeling more exposed than she had ever been in her life. A fragile truth that had stumbled into a fortress of lies. As she stood frozen in the doorway, the heavy oak door clicking softly shut behind her, she felt a definitive shift in the atmosphere, as if a storm had just gathered on the horizon. A new, palpable tension filled the air, a silent current that seemed to flow directly from the man in the bedroom and into the very foundations of the hotel. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, yet his presence had altered everything. The quiet hallway she had just left no longer felt empty. It felt charged, expectant. She had the unnerving sensation that her accidental trespass was not an ending but a beginning, an invisible thread pulled taut that connected her simple, structured life to a darkness she never knew existed, a darkness that was now looking right at her. Clara's world began not with the sun but with the weary groan of the radiator in her shoebox apartment overlooking a forgotten Chicago alley. The city's grand architectural bones, the very structures that fueled her dreams, were visible only as distant, skeletal silhouettes against a perpetually gray sky. Her morning routine was a silent ritual of fortitude, the cold wooden floor against her bare feet, the careful brewing of cheap coffee, the methodical way she dressed in professional, yet slightly worn attire. It was a life measured in careful economies of money, energy, and hope. Her blueprints, rolled and secured with a rubber band, sat on the small kitchen table like a sacred text, a promise of a future built with cleaner lines and more honest foundations than the one she currently inhabited. The commute was a daily exercise in anonymity. Pressed against the cold glass of a crowded L train, she watched the city unfold, a breathtaking tapestry of steel and glass that she longed to contribute to. Yet inside the rattling car, she was just another tired face, invisible. The journey took her from her modest neighborhood, with its brick walk-ups and sense of weary community, into the heart of the financial district, a sterile canyon of power where she felt like a trespasser. Each day, she carried the heavy weight of her aspirations in a leather briefcase with a frayed strap, a small but constant reminder of the gap between the world she envisioned and the one she was forced to navigate just to survive, a world that seemed to have no space for her. The offices of Sterling and Croft were a monument to minimalist oppression. Gleaming glass walls and stark white desks created an environment of forced transparency, where every keystroke and hushed conversation felt monitored. Her workspace was a small cubicle at the back, a clear indication of her junior status. Here, her passion for design was reduced to a commodity, her creative instincts sanded down by the firm's rigid, profit-driven aesthetic. Her boss, Arthur Sterling, a man who wore his entitlement like a tailored suit, moved through the office with an air of predatory calm. He rarely raised his voice, but his disapproval was a palpable force, a cold front that could chill the entire floor and curdle the ambition of anyone who dared to challenge his vision. Her days were a slow drip of indignities. She would spend weeks perfecting a detail, the elegant curve of a facade, the precise flow of light through a lobby, only to have Sterling present it in a client meeting as a fleeting thought he'd had that morning. He would dismiss her input with a paternalistic smile, calling her ideas charming, before steering the conversation back to his own established concepts. Clara learned to armor herself in silence, to nod and take notes as her work was co-opted, her voice erased from the narrative of her own creations. Each instance was a small death, a quiet chipping away at the core of her professional identity, forcing her to swallow the bitter taste of injustice just to keep her job. The pressure wasn't just professional, it was a tightening vice of financial necessity. An email from the loan company would flash on her screen, a stark reminder of the student debt that felt like an anchor dragging her down. Late-night calls from her mother, her voice thin with worry, added another layer of responsibility. Her father's illness had drained their family's savings years ago, leaving Clara as the sole pillar of support. This reality tethered her to Sterling's firm, making escape impossible. She wasn't just working for her dream, she was working to keep the lights on, to ensure her mother's prescriptions were filled, to honor a silent promise that she would be the one to restore her family's stability. This created an exhausting emotional duality. In the quiet solitude of her apartment, surrounded by textbooks and sketches, she was a visionary. She imagined buildings that breathed, spaces that nurtured community, and offered sanctuary from the city's harshness. She dreamt of creating something lasting and true, a legacy of beauty and integrity. But from 9 to 5, she was a ghost in the machine, a skilled pair of hands executing the uninspired visions of powerful men. This daily schism was taking its toll, leaving her feeling fractured, as if she were living two separate lives, neither of which felt entirely her own. The woman who dreamt in light was forced to survive in the shadows. Symbolic details of her life painted a portrait of quiet struggle. The institutional beige of her office computer, the insistent ticking of the clock on the wall marking hours that seemed to stretch into eternity. The weight of the heavy portfolio she lugged through the city. Even her lunch, always a simple sandwich eaten at her desk, was a testament to her constrained existence. She watched the senior partners leave for lavish client lunches at exclusive restaurants, their laughter echoing down the marble hallways, and felt the chasm between their world and hers widen into an impassable gulf. She was a cog in a machine that produced luxury, yet she could afford none of it herself. The Sovereign Hotel project was meant to be her breakthrough. It was her design, born from countless sleepless nights and a deep personal connection to the city's history. Sterling had allowed her to take the lead, a rare concession that filled her with a dangerous mix of hope and terror. The final presentation was the culmination of 2 years of her life. As the day approached, the pressure became a physical weight in her chest. She rehearsed her lines in the mirror, her voice sounding small and uncertain in her tiny bathroom. She knew this was her one chance to prove her worth, to step out from behind Sterling's shadow and claim her own space in the world. The presentation took place in a top-floor boardroom at the Sovereign, the city sprawling beneath them like a conquered kingdom. Clara began to speak, her voice gaining confidence as she described her vision. But halfway through, Sterling smoothly interrupted, taking over the presentation as if it were a symphony he was conducting. He used her words, her concepts, but delivered them with a proprietary swagger that made them his. He accepted the client's praise with a gracious nod, gesturing to Clara only once with a dismissive, "My talented protégé helped with the renderings." The humiliation was a cold, sharp blade. She was forced to stand there, smiling, a silent accessory to her own masterpiece. When the clients had gone, their handshakes and congratulations directed solely at Sterling, he turned to her. He didn't acknowledge her pain or the blatant theft of her work. Instead, he handed her a key card. "You've earned a night's rest. Don't be late tomorrow," he said, his tone suggesting it was a grand act of charity. He then left her alone in the cavernous, silent room with the architectural models that felt more like tombstones than triumphs. The weight of her blueprints in her arms felt heavier than ever as she walked out into the gilded hallway, utterly defeated, searching for a quiet room to break down in, never imagining she was about to find something far more dangerous. The memory of the penthouse of steam and scars clung to Clara like a phantom scent, making the hotel's opulent lobby feel even more alien. She sat at a small table in the corner of the hotel's grand restaurant, nursing a cup of coffee she couldn't afford, trying to disappear into the plush velvet of the chair. She was waiting for Sterling to sign off on a final invoice, a mundane task that felt like a final twist of the knife. The encounter with the man in Suite 1201 had unsettled her to her core, leaving behind a residue of fear and a strange, inexplicable curiosity. She had seen a glimpse of a world governed by a different kind of power, a raw and silent authority that made Sterling's corporate bullying seem pathetic and small in comparison. Sterling finally arrived, sliding into the opposite chair with a condescending smirk. He pushed the invoice back across the table, unsigned. "The clients had some notes, Clara," It seems your vision was a bit provincial. I've already made the necessary adjustments. He spoke just loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, his words a calculated public humiliation. He was erasing her from the project, piece by piece, right here in the open. Clara felt the familiar cold dread creep up her spine, the helplessness of being trapped by her circumstances. She opened her mouth to protest, to defend the 2 years of her life poured into those plans, but her voice caught in her throat, a choked whisper of defiance that died before it could be heard. It was then that the restaurant fell silent, not suddenly, but in a slow, spreading wave, as if a stone had been dropped into a still pond. The gentle murmur of conversations, the clinking of silverware against porcelain, it all faded into a heavy, respectful hush. A man had entered, flanked by 2 others, who remained discreetly by the entrance. He wore a tailored suit, the color of a midnight sky, its sharp lines a stark contrast to the fluid, predatory grace with which he moved. He didn't look at anyone, yet he seemed to see everything. His presence was a physical force, a drop in atmospheric pressure that commanded attention without demanding it. This was Dante Volkov, and Clara's heart stopped when she recognized the cold, unreadable eyes from the penthouse. His gaze swept the room with an unnerving stillness, a silent inventory of power and weakness. It passed over fawning waiters and nervous businessmen before it landed, with deliberate weight, on their table. He saw Sterling's smug expression, the unsigned papers, and the quiet, desperate fury in Clara's eyes. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, their worlds, the brutal, silent empire he commanded, and the small, honest space she fought to protect, converged in that single, penetrating look. Clara felt a primal jolt of fear, the instinct of prey caught in the gaze of a predator. But, this time, the fear was tangled with a bewildering sense of recognition, a feeling that this man saw the injustice more clearly than anyone else in the room. Dante moved toward their table, his steps silent on the thick Persian rug. He didn't spare Clara a glance. His focus was entirely on Sterling, whose face had drained of all color, his arrogant posture dissolving into a rigid, fearful stillness. Dante stopped beside the table and placed a hand, gently, on the back of Sterling's chair. He leaned in, his voice a low, almost inaudible murmur that was meant for Sterling alone. The original designs were impeccable. You will approve them, unchanged. It was not a request. It was a verdict. He then picked up Sterling's pen, laid it on the invoice, and straightened up, his chillingly calm gaze still fixed on the terrified architect. Sterling's hand trembled as he signed. With the deed done, Dante finally turned his eyes to Clara. The coldness was still there, but underneath it, she saw something else. A flicker of something ancient and unyielding, a silent acknowledgement. It wasn't kindness or pity. It was a look of stark, unsettling understanding, as if he recognized the steel in her spine because he was forged from the same material, only hardened by a much hotter fire. He was seeing the fighter in her, the part of her that refused to break completely, and in his world of shadows and deceit, that kind of strength was a rare, dangerous commodity. The look held her captive, a silent communication that was more profound than any words could ever be. She couldn't breathe. The air was thick with his power, with the unspoken threat that had just saved her. She felt a terrifying mix of gratitude and revulsion. This man, a figure from the city's darkest whispers, had defended her honor more effectively than she ever could. He had intervened in her small, mundane struggle with the casual authority of a king settling a dispute among peasants. The act tied her to him in some invisible, unwelcome way. She was now indebted to a ghost, a man whose protection was likely more dangerous than any threat Sterling could ever pose. The moral clarity of her world had been shattered, leaving her adrift in a gray, ambiguous sea. Sterling sat frozen, his face a mask of ashen terror. The signature on the page was a jagged, spidery mark, a testament to his broken composure. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He wouldn't meet anyone's. The public humiliation he had intended for her had been turned back on him with breathtaking efficiency. The other diners pretended not to watch, their gazes fixed on their plates, but the tension was a living thing in the room. Clara understood then that Dante Volkov didn't rule with violence alone. He ruled with the precise, surgical application of fear, dismantling a man's pride and power without ever raising his voice, leaving him hollowed out and exposed for all to see. Without another word, Dante turned and walked away. The silence followed him, a reverent wake that only began to dissipate once he had vanished through the grand archway of the restaurant. The moment he was gone, the room took a collective breath. The low murmur of conversation slowly returned, but it was fragile, strained. The spell was broken, but the magic, dark and powerful, lingered in the air. The atmosphere was forever changed, charged with the memory of his presence. Clara felt as if she had been standing at the edge of a cliff and had just been pulled back by the most dangerous man she could ever imagine. She was left alone at the table, the signed invoice a damning piece of evidence of what had transpired. Sterling had already fled, leaving his half-finished drink behind. Clara looked down at the paper, at her name printed neatly beside the project title, now validated by an act of silent, terrifying power. The victory felt hollow, tainted. She was no longer just an anonymous architect fighting for her place in the world. She had been seen, and she had been chosen, for a reason she could not comprehend, by Dante Volkov. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this was not an end, but the beginning of a story she was not prepared to live. The weeks that followed the restaurant incident were a study in forced normalcy. Clara immersed herself in the Sovereign project, the clean, logical lines of her blueprints, a welcome refuge from the chaotic memory of Dante Volkov. She worked with a feverish intensity, hoping the familiar weight of her drafting tools and the scent of fresh paper could exorcise his ghost. Yet, his presence lingered, a phantom pressure at the back of her mind. Every shadow in a long corridor seemed to hold his shape. Every sudden silence in a room felt like his arrival. She told herself she was grateful for his intervention, but terrified of its implications. He had pulled back a curtain to a world she never wanted to see. And now, she couldn't unknow the darkness that lay just beneath the city's gilded surface, a darkness that had looked at her with unsettling recognition. Her carefully constructed peace shattered on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Seeking shelter in a small, quiet bookstore cafe she often frequented, she found a corner table to review some sketches. The scent of old books and brewing coffee was a comforting anchor to her reality. Then she felt it, a shift in the room's atmosphere, the same drop in pressure she'd experienced at the hotel. She looked up slowly, her heart beginning a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs. He was there, seated in a secluded alcove across the room, a book open but unread in his hands. He wasn't looking at the page. He was looking at her. His gaze was steady and unnervingly patient, a silent declaration that her world was no longer entirely her own. He had found her in her sanctuary. Fear was her first instinct, a cold, primal urge to gather her things and flee. But she was paralyzed, caught in the intensity of his stare. It felt less like a threat and more like a question she didn't know how to answer. The other patrons seemed oblivious, lost in their own worlds, creating an invisible bubble of silence around the two of them. In that moment, Clara felt a strange, unwelcome pull, a fascination with the stillness he projected, with the sheer, unshakable power that emanated from him even in a place of such quiet contemplation. She felt exposed, as if he could see past the professional facade to the loneliness and fight she carried inside. And the most terrifying part was that she didn't want to look away. Their encounters began to accumulate, each one a perfectly orchestrated coincidence that felt anything but. She would be working late at the Sovereign construction site, the only soul in the skeletal lobby, and he would appear from the shadows, ostensibly to inspect the progress. He moved through the unfinished space with a proprietor's ease, his expensive leather shoes silent on the dusty concrete floor. His presence dwarfed the cavernous room, making her feel both incredibly small and acutely visible. He would stand near her, not speaking for long moments, the air between them thick with unspoken words, with the shared knowledge of the power he had wielded on her behalf. The silence was a living entity, charged with danger and a strange, burgeoning intimacy. One night, surrounded by exposed steel beams and draped plastic sheeting, he finally broke the silence. "The acoustics will be perfect here," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be absorbed by the raw materials around them. It was a simple observation, yet it was aimed directly at her, an acknowledgement of her craft. You have a gift for creating quiet spaces in a loud world. Clara was taken aback, her throat tight. She managed a small nod, unable to form a reply. His insight was too sharp, too personal. He wasn't just seeing the building, he was seeing her, the architect of silent sanctuaries, because she herself was one. It was a moment of profound, unnerving connection. From the periphery of her vision, she studied him, catching glimpses of the man behind the formidable myth. She saw the faint lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, the controlled tension in his hands as he clasped them behind his back. She realized he was drawn to the site not just as an owner, but as someone seeking the same quiet he had credited her with creating. He, too, seemed to be searching for a sanctuary. This realization was a dangerous crack in her defenses. It humanized him, transforming him from a monolithic figure of fear into something far more complex and unsettling. A man carrying his own invisible burdens. A man whose profound loneliness seemed to mirror her own in a darker, more violent key. The encounters grew bolder, blurring the lines between surveillance and protection. His black sedan would be parked across the street from her office building when she left late at night, pulling away into the darkness only after she was safely in a taxi. Once, during a sudden downpour, the same car glided to a stop beside her, the back door swinging open in a silent invitation. She hesitated, rain plastering her hair to her face, her heart pounding. It was a choice. Step into his world or remain in her own, soaked and vulnerable. With a sense of fatalistic resolve, she got in, and they rode in complete, suffocating silence until he stopped a block from her apartment, a silent concession to her privacy. She was trapped in a dizzying, emotional conflict. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to run, to disappear, to sever this inexplicable tie to a man whose name was synonymous with violence. Yet, a deeper, more treacherous part of her was drawn to the silent, unwavering strength he offered. In a life where she had always been the protector, the responsible one, the feeling of being protected was a potent, addictive poison. He made her feel safe in a way that was fundamentally unsafe, a paradox that began to consume her thoughts. She was terrified of him, but she was starting to become more terrified of the thought of him disappearing completely from the edges of her life. The tension became physical, a constant, low-grade hum whenever he was near. In the tight confines of his car, the scent of his cologne, something clean and expensive, like sandalwood and cold night air, filled her senses, a stark contrast to the city's grime. He passed her a file she had left at the site, and their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second. The contact was brief, accidental, yet it sent a jolt through her entire body, a spark of heat that was both frightening and undeniable. She pulled her hand back as if burned, the spot still tingling with a strange, forbidden energy long after the moment had passed. His face remained impassive, but she saw a flicker in his eyes, a sign that he had felt it too. Their connection deepened in these silent, charged moments. Words felt clumsy, inadequate for the complex understanding that was growing between them. A shared look across a crowded hotel lobby could convey a warning, a question, or a simple, profound acknowledgement of each other's presence. He was the only one who saw the steel beneath her quiet demeanor, and she was perhaps the only one who saw the flicker of a weary soul behind his mask of absolute control. They were two solitary figures from opposing worlds, circling each other in a slow, dangerous dance, each recognizing in the other a reflection of their own carefully guarded isolation. The bond was forged not in conversation, but in shared silence. She began to see his world not as a caricature of gangster films, but as a kingdom of quiet, ruthless efficiency, built on loyalty and fear. He commanded it not with outbursts of rage, but with an unnerving stillness, a deep understanding of human weakness. She saw men twice his size defer to him with a single, cold glance. This wasn't the chaotic violence she had imagined. It was something far more disciplined and terrifying. And yet, when his attention was on her, that same intimidating focus felt like a shield. She was beginning to understand that his protection was a double-edged sword, a guarantee of her safety that also marked her as belonging to him in some unspoken, dangerous way. He, in turn, found himself increasingly disarmed by her. He watched her from a distance, observing her small acts of integrity in a world that rewarded compromise. He saw her meticulously correct an overcharge on a supplier's invoice that would have benefited the project, a small, principled stand no one else would have noticed. He saw the genuine empathy in her eyes as she spoke to a construction worker who had been injured on site. These moments of quiet decency were like a foreign language he was slowly beginning to remember. She was a constant, unnerving reminder of a moral compass he had abandoned long ago, and her very existence challenged the cynical foundations upon which he had built his entire empire. The fragile peace, however, was destined to break. Arthur Sterling, publicly humiliated and professionally neutered by Dante's intervention, was not a man to forgive or forget. His resentment festered, curdling into a venomous need for revenge. Unable to strike at Dante directly, he aimed his poison at the one person he knew was the cause of his downfall. The whispers started in the office, rumors about Clara's incompetence, suggestions that she had secured the sovereign contract through unprofessional means. It was a subtle, insidious campaign designed to dismantle her reputation and destroy the career she had fought so hard to build, a slow-acting venom meant to isolate and crush her. The campaign escalated from whispers to actions. One evening, Clara returned to her office to find her cubicle in disarray. Key blueprints for the sovereign were missing, and the detailed scale model she had spent months creating was shattered on the floor, its delicate balconies and elegant facades reduced to a pile of splintered balsa wood and broken dreams. It was a petty, cowardly act of destruction, designed to hit her where she was most vulnerable. There was no proof it was Sterling, but she knew. A cold, sickening dread washed over her. This was a message. She was alone, and her enemies were closing in, no longer content to remain in the shadows. That night, as she walked the short, familiar distance from the train station to her apartment, the feeling of being watched was more acute than ever. But this time, it wasn't Dante's silent guardianship. It was something hostile, predatory. Two large men stepped out from the mouth of a dark alley, blocking her path. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. Their intentions were clear in their cold, dead eyes and the menacing way they began to advance on her. Her blood ran cold. She clutched her worn briefcase to her chest, her mind racing, realizing with absolute terror that Sterling's vendetta had moved beyond professional sabotage into something far more dangerous and real. Before a scream could even form in her throat, a black car materialized out of the darkness, its engine a low, menacing growl. It mounted the curb, its headlights pinning the two men in a blinding white glare. The passenger door opened, and Dante Volkov emerged. He moved with a lethal, fluid grace, not a hint of hurry or panic in his posture. He said nothing to the men, he simply looked at them, and in that look was a promise of a violence so absolute that they flinched as if struck. They hesitated for a moment, then turned and vanished back into the alley like startled rats. The sudden, terrifying threat had been neutralized with a silence more potent than any weapon. He stood before her in the sudden quiet of the street, the car's engine idling softly, the only sound in the world. The space between them crackled, with the aftermath of violence averted. He looked from the empty alley back to her, his expression an unreadable mask of cold fury. His gaze dropped to her white-knuckled grip on her briefcase, to the tremor running through her body. For the first time, she saw something beyond control in his eyes, a raw, protective instinct that was almost frightening in its intensity. He had been watching. He had always been watching. She was not just a curiosity to him. She was something he had decided to claim, and therefore, to protect at all costs. He moved into the cone of light, his shadow swallowing her whole. The cold fury radiating from him was a tangible thing, a winter storm contained within the sharp lines of his suit. He did not ask if she was all right. The question was an insult to the violence he had just quelled. His eyes, dark and unforgiving, conducted a swift, clinical assessment, searching for any sign of injury, with an intensity that was more terrifying than the threat itself. She saw in that gaze a deep, possessive anger, not directed at her, but at the world for daring to touch what he had, for some unspoken reason, deemed his to observe. This was not the act of a savior. It was the act of a king reclaiming his territory, and she was the piece on the board he had decided could not be taken, a violation of a code only he understood. Without a word, he reached out, not to comfort her, but to take the briefcase from her nerveless fingers. The simple transfer of weight was a profound shift in power. He was taking her burden, her shield, her identity, and holding it as if it weighed nothing. He opened the car door, a silent, absolute command. This was her moment of transgression, the precipice between her world of moral certainties and his of brutal necessities. Every instinct screamed for her to run, to thank him and disappear back into the anonymity he had just violently preserved. But her legs wouldn't move. She looked from the dark, inviting maw of the car to the empty, threatening street, and understood that there was no longer a safe direction. She was choosing the nature of her danger, and with a breath that felt like a surrender, she stepped inside. The ride was a journey through a vacuum. The city's chaotic symphony of sirens and traffic was completely sealed out, replaced by the hushed hum of the engine and the scent of old leather and cold, clean air. Dante drove with an economy of motion, his hands steady on the wheel, his profile a stoic silhouette against the blurred neon lights. Clara watched the familiar streets of her life slide by like scenes from a film she was no longer in. She felt suspended between two realities, no longer the struggling architect from the gritty side of town, but not yet a resident of the gilded cage she was being transported to. The silence in the car was heavier than any conversation, filled with the gravity of his actions and her complicity in accepting his protection. She had crossed a line, and the path back was already gone. He took her not to her apartment, but back to the Sovereign Hotel, gliding into a private underground entrance she never knew existed. They ascended in a silent, brass-lined elevator that opened directly into his penthouse. The space was exactly as she remembered it, a cavern of shadows and wealth. But now it felt different. The first time, she had been an accidental trespasser. Now she was an invited guest, brought here under the dark wing of his protection, and the change in status was disorienting. He placed her briefcase on a heavy mahogany table and moved to the bar, the clinking of ice against crystal, the only sound to break the oppressive stillness. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid, his back to her, every movement deliberate and controlled, a stark contrast to the chaos roiling inside her. He turned and held out a glass. She shook her head, unable to speak, her throat tight with a fear that had finally begun to thaw into a bone-deep tremor. Her hands were shaking, and she clasped them together to still them. His eyes followed the movement, his gaze sharpening. He set the glasses down and walked toward her, stopping just inches away. The sheer proximity of him was overwhelming, a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, see the faint silvery lines of a scar that disappeared beneath the collar of his shirt. He was a landscape of healed over violence, and she was standing at the very edge of it, defenseless and exposed in the heart of his fortress. "You're hurt," he stated, his voice a low, rough murmur that was not a question. Before she could protest, he gently took her left hand. On her palm was a small, raw scrape, a mosaic of red from where she must have stumbled against a brick wall. It was an insignificant injury, a tiny mar on her skin, but he held her hand as if it were a priceless, shattered artifact. The world seemed to narrow to that single point of contact, the warmth of his thumb stroking softly near the wound, a gesture of such unexpected tenderness from a man she knew was capable of unspeakable brutality. The gesture was a contradiction that shattered all her assumptions, a quiet act of care that felt more intimate and revealing than any confession. His touch was not a prelude to passion, it was a form of penance. As his fingers traced the edges of her skin, she looked up into his eyes and saw it. Not coldness, not anger, but a deep, ancient well of guilt. It was a flicker of a ghost from his past, the shadow of another woman, another failure, another moment where he had been too late. In that instant, she understood. Protecting her wasn't about her at all. It was about him. She was a chance for him to rewrite a history he couldn't escape, a fragile echo of a promise he had once broken. He was not saving her from the world. He was attempting to save himself from a memory, and her presence was the crucible for his impossible, silent redemption. For Dante, the feel of her small, trembling hand in his was a profound shock to his system. He had spent years building walls of detachment, treating people as assets or obstacles, his touch reserved for violence or sterile transactions. But this was different. The simple, human fragility of her skin against his calloused fingers was a vulnerability he had not allowed himself to feel in decades. He was a man who commanded armies with a nod, who broke empires in silence, yet he found himself completely disarmed by a single scrape on the palm of an honest architect. In his attempt to shield her from his world, he had inadvertently let a sliver of her world, of light, of feeling, of consequence, pierce his own armor. The act of protection had become an act of profound self-exposure. By bringing her here, by tending to this small wound, he had broken his most sacred rule: never get personally involved. He was Dante Volkov, the ghost, a man who existed in the shadows, whose power was derived from his emotional distance. But as he looked at Clara, at the defiant fear in her eyes, he was no longer a ghost. He was a man, burdened by a past he could not outrun, and a present he could no longer control. He saw his own long-buried humanity reflected in her, and the sight of it was both a torment and a strange, unwelcome relief. He had stepped out of the darkness for her, and he wasn't sure he knew how to step back in. He released her hand, the sudden absence of his touch, leaving the air cold and charged. The moment was broken, but its impact was indelible, a permanent shift in the foundation of their strange, unspoken relationship. They stood in the vast, silent penthouse, the city's glittering skyline a distant, indifferent witness. Nothing had been said, yet everything had changed. He had revealed a wound, and she had seen it. She had accepted his protection, and in doing so, had stepped under the shadow of his guilt. There was no going back to the safety of their separate worlds. The silence that fell between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of a shared, dangerous truth. If you felt the weight of that moment, share this story so others can experience it too. Like and comment what you think will happen next, because the silence is about to break. The drive back to her apartment was a descent from a storm-ravaged peak into an unnervingly quiet valley. Dante drove with a rigid formality that had not been there before, his hands gripping the wheel at 10 and 2, a soldier returning to his post. The raw, vulnerable intimacy of the penthouse had evaporated, leaving a cold, professional vacuum in its place. He did not speak, and she did not dare to. When he pulled up a block from her building, the engine's soft idle was the only sound. He didn't look at her as she reached for the door handle. "Stay away from the construction site after dark," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the emotion she had seen in his eyes. It was a command, a dismissal, and a final, brutal act of protection. The door clicked shut behind her, a sound of absolute finality, leaving her alone on the wet pavement under the sickly orange glow of a street lamp. Back inside her small apartment, the familiar space felt alien, a stage set for a life she no longer recognized. The scrape on her palm throbbed, a physical reminder of a world that should not have touched hers. She stood at her window for what felt like hours, watching the rain slick the streets into ribbons of black glass. She could see the distant, glittering spire of the Sovereign Hotel piercing the low-hanging clouds, a monument to the chasm that now separated them. He was up there in his silent kingdom of shadows, and she was down here, in her world of quiet, honest work. The silence he left behind was a tangible presence, a heavy blanket that smothered every other thought. It was the sound of a door being locked, of a path being permanently closed, and the emptiness was a far greater weight than the fear had ever been. The consequences of Dante's intervention rippled through her professional life with unnerving speed. The next morning, she arrived at the office to a strange, charged atmosphere. Arthur Sterling's office was empty, his nameplate already removed from the door. Whispers followed her down the hall. He had resigned, effective immediately, for personal reasons. No one believed it. Her colleagues now looked at her with a new, unsettling mixture of awe and fear. They kept their distance, speaking to her in hushed, careful tones. The victory she should have felt was completely absent, replaced by a profound sense of isolation. She had not won this battle. A king had swept her peace across the board, and in doing so, had marked her as untouchable, setting her apart from everyone else in a way that felt more like a brand than a blessing. Dante retreated into his own darkness, a deliberate and necessary withdrawal. The attack on Clara was a symptom of a larger problem. His focus had been compromised. His enemies, circling like sharks that had scented blood in the water, saw his uncharacteristic interest in the architect as a weakness, a chink in the impenetrable armor of the ghost. He spent his days in a darkened office, high above the city, dismantling the threats that had emerged in his moment of distraction. He moved with a renewed, cold-blooded precision, making ruthless decisions that reestablished his authority and sent a clear, violent message to his rivals. Every brutal choice, every enforced loyalty, was a stone he placed on the wall he was rebuilding around himself, a fortress designed not only to protect his empire, but to keep the memory of her innocent, defiant eyes from finding its way inside. The absence of his presence was a slow, creeping chill. The black sedan no longer shadowed her route home from the train. The construction site, once a place of charged silence and shared secrets, became just a building again, a collection of steel, concrete, and her own lonely ambition. The void he left was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of her days. She found herself scanning crowds for his tall, imposing figure, listening for the low rumble of his car's engine, a part of her still expecting him to materialize from the shadows. The relief of being safe was overshadowed by a strange, hollow ache. She had been terrified of his world, but she had also, in some treacherous part of her soul, felt seen within it. Now she was invisible again, and the anonymity she had once craved felt like a profound and desolate loss. Clara poured her confusion and heartache into her work, finding a strange solace in the clean, unforgiving logic of architecture. The blueprints became her sanctuary, a world where every line had a purpose, every angle a reason. She worked with a quiet, ferocious determination, not just to prove Sterling wrong, but to prove to herself that her strength was her own, not something borrowed from a dangerous man in the dark. The pain of his absence began to transform, sharpening from a dull ache into a diamond-hard lucidity. She understood the intoxicating poison of his protection and the terrible price it demanded. He had saved her from Sterling's thugs, but she was the only one who could save herself from the memory of his touch, from the dangerous hope of being saved at all. One afternoon, she stood alone in the grand, skeletal lobby of the Sovereign. Sunlight streamed through the unfinished windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. She walked to the very spot where he had stood and told her she had a gift for creating quiet spaces. She closed her eyes and listened. The distant sounds of the city were muted, just as he had predicted. The acoustics were perfect. It was a space of profound, intentional silence, a sanctuary she had designed. But the quiet no longer felt like a shared secret. It felt like an echo. It was the sound of his departure, of a conversation that would never be finished. She placed her hand against the cold, unfinished, concrete wall, a final, silent acknowledgement of the ghost who haunted the masterpiece she was building. To erase the last vestiges of his perceived weakness, Dante made a calculated, brutal move. A rival syndicate boss who had been making inquiries about the architect vanished without a trace, his operations collapsing overnight in a swift, silent coup. The underworld buzzed with the news. The message was unequivocal. The ghost was back, more ruthless and untouchable than ever. It was an act of extreme violence, carried out with the cold detachment of a surgeon excising a tumor. He did it to restore order, to protect his empire, but on a deeper level he did it to sever the final, invisible thread connecting his world to hers. He was cauterizing the wound she had opened, burying the man who had held her hand under the cold, hard earth of his reputation. He had to become the monster everyone feared to keep her safe from him. Clara, meanwhile, found a different kind of strength. During a tense project meeting with the hotel's demanding new financiers, a senior partner tried to dismiss one of her key design choices as impractical. The old Clara would have shrunk back, deferring in silence. But this time, she held her ground. She met the man's condescending gaze and, with a calm, steady voice, articulated her reasoning with unshakable logic and passion. She did not raise her voice, she simply stated the truth of her design. The room fell quiet, and the financier, impressed by her quiet conviction, nodded in agreement. It was a small moment, a minor victory in a corporate boardroom, but for Clara, it was everything. She had found her own voice, and it was strong enough. As night fell, they existed in their separate solitudes, two souls bound by an impossible memory. From his penthouse, Dante watched the city lights ignite, a cold, glittering kingdom he ruled but could never truly inhabit. His victory felt like ash in his mouth. Miles away, in her small apartment, Clara sketched a new design on a clean sheet of paper, the soft scratch of graphite, the only sound. She was building a future with her own two hands, a future defined by her own integrity. They were both alone, looking out at the same silent city, separated by a gulf of morality and circumstance. The connection between them remained, not as a hope, but as a permanent, silent echo of what could never be, a shared secret that would forever haunt the quiet spaces of their lives. A year later, the Sovereign Hotel opened its doors in a symphony of glittering champagne flutes and hushed, powerful voices. Clara stood near the grand staircase she had designed, a figure of quiet confidence in a simple, elegant, dark blue dress. She was no longer the frightened junior architect clutching blueprints like a shield. She was the celebrated artist of this magnificent space, accepting congratulations with a calm, genuine grace. Every polished marble floor, every perfectly lit alcove, was a testament to her vision, a physical manifestation of the voice she had fought so hard to find. Yet, amidst the sea of admiring faces, her gaze occasionally drifted toward the shadows, searching for a ghost she told herself was no longer there, a silent acknowledgement of the brutal catalyst that had allowed this triumph to be entirely her own. He arrived not through the grand entrance but from a private corridor, materializing on a balcony overlooking the main hall like a specter returning to his haunt. Dante Volkov stood in the periphery, a silent, unmoving figure in a perfectly tailored black suit, his presence a point of absolute stillness in the swirling vortex of the gala. He observed the scene with the detached air of a king surveying his kingdom, his face an unreadable mask of control. He was not there to celebrate, he was there to witness. He watched Clara move through the crowd, saw the unforced confidence in her posture and the clear, bright intelligence in her eyes. He saw a masterpiece, and for the first time, it was not the building he was looking at, but the woman who had built it, and herself, from the ground up. Their eyes met across the cavernous lobby. The cacophony of the party, the music, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, faded into a profound, absolute silence that existed only for the two of them. It was a look that spanned the unbridgeable chasm between their worlds, a silent conversation held in the space between heartbeats. He saw no fear in her eyes, only a quiet, unyielding strength he now recognized as her core. She saw no threat in his, only the deep, melancholic echo of the man who had shown her his guilt in the dim light of his penthouse. It was an acknowledgement of a shared, dangerous secret, a final, silent accounting of a debt that had been paid in full by both of them in their own separate ways. A moment of stark, painful, and beautiful clarity. In that suspended moment, Clara made a choice. The old her would have looked away, her heart pounding with a familiar mix of fear and fascination. But the woman she was now, the architect of this very space, did not break her gaze. She slowly, deliberately raised her champagne flute. It was not a gesture of gratitude, nor one of invitation. It was a salute. A quiet, solemn acknowledgement from one survivor to another, a recognition of the darkness they had both navigated to arrive at this point. It was her final, silent word on the matter, a declaration that she understood his sacrifice, accepted her own journey, and was now, finally, the sole proprietor of her own strength, standing firmly in the world of light she had built for herself. Dante watched her gesture, and for a fleeting instant, the mask of impenetrable control slipped. A flicker of something ancient and weary crossed his features, a profound, soul-deep acknowledgement of her message. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture so small that anyone else would have missed it. But to her, it was everything. It was his absolution, his farewell, and his final act of letting her go. Then, as seamlessly as he had appeared, he turned and melted back into the shadows of the corridor from which he came, leaving behind not a void, but a sense of closure. His redemption was not in changing who he was, but in ensuring she could become everything she was meant to be, far from the darkness of his world. Clara lowered her glass, the faint hum of the party slowly returning to her senses. She stood alone in the heart of her creation, the air no longer charged with tension, but filled with a quiet, bittersweet peace. He was a ghost in her city of glass, a silent foundation she would never have to build on again. If this story of silence and redemption touched your heart, let us know in the comments. Share it with someone who needs to see that light can grow even in the darkest foundations. And subscribe for more stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. For in the end, the quietest gestures often carry the greatest weight, echoing long after the final word is spoken.